we didn't come from a line of brain-eating apes necessarily, but I mean, there's a lot of truth there.
Hello and welcome to episode 10 of the Who Cares Anyway podcast. My guest on this episode is Peter Conheim. Now, some of you may remember an old BASF slogan from the 1980s and 90s, and maybe it's still current, but it went something like this. At BASF, we don't make a lot of the products you buy, we make a lot of the products you buy better. And that slogan came to mind as I was talking to Peter Conheim and sort of taking stock of the many projects that he has been involved in and lent his talents to over the years. And to name just a few that we actually do touch on in this interview, those include his film restoration work with the Cinema Preservation Alliance, his audio restoration and production work, including a recent archival release of the Mutants called Curse of the Easily Amused, a band that he also performs in as bassist in their current live incarnation, and then Negativland, which he joined in the mid-90s and was a member of for a couple of decades. But in addition to making other records and bands and films better, Peter has also led several endeavors of his own, including Monopause, which he co-founded with Mark Jurgis in the early 90s and carried into the 2000s. They eventually morphed into Neung Phak, their Southeast Asian pop alter ego, and then the Electro Motive label, which Peter founded in, I believe, 1990. And that focuses on a particular group of bands that I don't get into in the book, and to be honest, I'm still not terribly knowledgeable about, to put it politely. And that, in turn, is a big reason why I wanted to have Peter on as a guest. In other words, his involvement with lots of things that were adjacent to, but just outside the scope of what I was able to include in the book, with Monopause, in my mind, coming after the time period discussed in the book, although, as we'll hear, they were actually founded, 1992, so kind of at the tail end. But then also that Oakland warehouse scene that we do talk about in the interview. I was focusing more on San Francisco with occasional detours into the East Bay, but there is a story to be told about the East Bay that perhaps someone out there is working on or will decide to work on. A couple of clarifications. At one point, I referred to Eyes, Ears, and Throats. The correct title is actually Ears, Eyes, and Throats, but that is a collection of short films that Peter restored and compiled that was very helpful to me in my research on the book, in particular Daft Punk and In the Red, both of which were shown at the book release event in San Francisco back in March. And then there is a reference to a Lexa, and that is Lexa Walsh, from the Afterworld Lounge / Heinz Club. And again, I'll have to admit, I'm not terribly clear on the chronology, but Peter talks a little bit about that venue and its connection to the Oakland scene that we discussed sort of in the first part of the interview. And then finally, as for the very beginning of the interview, well, the official backstory behind Monopause is that they formed in Wisconsin, River Falls, Wisconsin, and I took that at face value, and that accounts for the somewhat sputtering start to the interview. I asked him about moving from Wisconsin, and So with all that out of the way, I'll go ahead and step aside and let us get on with the interview with Peter Conheim.
The whole thing is fake.
Oh, God. Well, see here. How about this?
There was no River Falls, Wisconsin involvement with Monopause. That was me and Mark's ruse. But originally we were real, we were talking like this. Well, back there in River Falls, that's where we were from. That was actually part of our shtick.
Okay. Well, because it would not have been out of the realm of what would be realistic. I mean, you had
I don't know.
all kinds of groups of, say, the Thinking Fellers coming from Iowa, kind of coming out en masse, or you had other groups coming from upstate New York, or maybe groups of people, if not actual bands.
I mean, MX80 Sound, who I've been working with for, well, I've known Dale since I was 10 years old, and like he's one of my oldest friends. MX80 Sound is from Bloomington, and they moved to San Francisco in 77 or 8 to, just try to take it more seriously. So yeah, I mean, it's there's a precedent.
So are you a Bay Area native then?
More or less. I mean, I was born in New York. My whole family's from New York on both sides, but I moved here in 1970 when I was 2. So I am effectively a Berkeley native, effectively speaking.
Okay, okay. Well, here I was thinking that there was a sort of period in which you arrived. I would say a minority of people. Let's say I interviewed 110 people.
Wow.
I get for over the course of the book, and it would be. I'm sure it's less than 50%, probably less than a third, who were actually from the Bay Area.
Oh, absolutely. People, yeah, my girlfriend is born and raised here, and she's one of the few people I have known who was, even through my childhood, whatever people, my best friend Anthony, who I started the record label with, Electro Motive, he's from Indiana. He's from, not, is it Bloomington? I can't remember. No, but yeah, I mean, very few of us are natives.
Can we say that there was a certain point at which Monopause formed?
Yeah. And I mean, the 1992 was when I met Mark and when we started. And it was just a duo. Um, the first year and a half, we didn't perform, we just recorded. And then our first gig was in 1993. So let's see, if you came in 99, you missed, geez, you missed the Heinz Club, which was known as the Afterworld Lounge. Yeah, the Heinz Club was really important, to that whole, just to the East Bay scene. It was huge, and it was the center in a lot of ways. It was the only center in the East Bay, really. And then it eventually, like I said, managed to get touring acts to come through too. Like, so it would be a national stop. And so the Heinz Club on Grand, and then when they got suddenly just blocked her out and closed the doors, she moved the operation to Larry Blake's in Berkeley, and that was like Afterward Lounge Part 2. And Monopause's first show was the last night of, I believe it was the last night, if I have my history right. God, I can't believe I've forgotten this. It was a significant event. But yeah, it was Little My, Fibrillator, and Us. I'm pretty sure it was how she closed the Afterworld Lounge. It was either the first show or the last show. I can't remember.
Okay.
Wow.
The venue that I remember going to in, let's see, I don't have a good visual. I don't have a good sense of direction at Oakland. I just knew Bart Stops and stuff. But was Hecko's? Was that?
Oh, on
Hecko's?
on Peralta near 7th Street. Yeah. Well, that was our sax and General Mayhem players loft, and we would do secret shows there. Yeah.
Right. So I saw at least a couple of shows of touring bands coming through there,
Yeah,
smaller touring bands.
he got a few things to happen from touring. Like Wolf Eyes played there. Um, this amazing Japanese band that only ever came here once. I forget what they're called now, but they have a very strange name. They came. Yeah, Thinking Fellers played there, I think twice, maybe 3 times. Once with us. Oh yeah, I mean it was a great spot, but it's funny. I just have to say I've looked back. A lot of us have looked back on that era since the Ghost Ship fire and realized like that was as dumb or dumber place to cram people than the Ghost Ship. It also had one way in and one way out, but unlike the Ghost Ship, Hecko had nailed all the windows shut. He had boarded up all the windows for sound, so it was unbelievably unsafe. And I remember one gig where he did a pyrotechnics like magic show of sorts, just Hecko himself. And I remember flame like going up to the ceiling and almost lighting the ceiling on fire. I mean, it was completely insane. And then when the Thinking Fellers and Us played there in 94 or 93, the floor almost caved in. The floor was like, everyone was dancing so much and the floor was buckling. So then when he did the next show, he convinced the owners of the store downstairs to let him put an I-beam up to like,
Oh wow.
Either an I-beam, it couldn't have been an I-beam, I-beams go this way, but it was like he put up like a post so that the floor wouldn't fall in. I mean, I can't believe we did this shit. I can't fucking believe it. I knew two people that died at the ghost ship, and like, it just one was a friend, and I just can't believe we did it, frankly.
Did you find that, let's say between 95 and 2000, say that things were more happening or more, at least more hospitable over in Oakland, or was that?
Yeah, I think for sure, but at the same time, there were still a couple of clubs that were um, going strong in the city that were basically doing the same thing as like Lexa was doing. Was it 95? Is that? Yeah, like the Night Break, which was also called the Thirsty Swede
Okay.
on Hate. There were a few, but yeah, generally speaking, yeah, I think there was more going on, and there was more. And it's true, there was an exodus of people when the rents started to go completely insane, 95-ish. I think that's about right. Because I remember I was dating a woman in 94, and she was having a really hard time finding a place in San Francisco at the time. And then it became like she got one just in time, and then it became impossible. So, yeah, I mean, but the West Oakland thing has its own interesting history because, and I'm assuming you don't get into this in the book because it's so fucking obscure, but I think it's really amazing and kind of forgotten is that corridor where Hecko's place was for like a block and a half. The basically was that block and then a little bit to the east. That section from about 80, 89, 90, all the way up to, well, I guess it didn't last that long. Let's call it 95, 6. 95, 96. There were so many bands living in that 2 square block radius and so many rehearsal spaces that you could basically walk down 7th Street and hear a different band coming out. It was like a really amazing moment. There was a downstairs from Hecko's, before there was a store, there was a rehearsal space. Down the block, on the corner, near the corner, there was a thing called the Railroad Lounge. It was pretty short-lived. Saw some amazing shows there. There was always something going on right in that time. And that was when the crime also was really like the person on person crime was really bad. Everybody got mugged. There were a lot of drug deaths and like not, well, there was actually at least one, but I mean, drug, like there was a shootout at the liquor store down the block, and like bad shit happened. I remember Jeff coming into rehearsal, like ashen face. He's like, I just saw a guy get shot in his car, and all these people were on the street going, they shot Shitty. Shitty got shot. Well, I remember that. I don't know. But that stretch was such a fertile in the early 90s. Early 90s. That was like, there were like 10 bands that lived right there, including us. And so yeah, it didn't last, but for that couple of years, it was really dynamic. It was crazy. I mean, Lex's house is at the corner of 7th and Peralta. Across the street was Hecko's place, and then we were next door to Lexa. Our space was right there. That's where Mark lived. So, but that's only a little. I mean, there was so much more before that. Yeah.
Who were some of the other bands?
Well, Fibulator, Din Triptych, Little My, all rehearsed right there. Don't think the Thinking Fellers ever had a space there, but I mean later Ann married Rick from Din Triptych, and they lived around the corner. But I guess Thinking Fellers are kind of inactive then. Yeah, I mean those are the bands I remember, but there were more. I remember that Ken from Fibulator, I think he did like the first East Bay, maybe the only East Bay show of World of Pooh, Barbara Manning's band with Jay Padgett and Brandon Kearney. I think that was at Lex's house in 1990, 89, 90, 91, like in there.
Yeah, 80, yeah, probably 89.
Yeah,
80,
which is when
80.
Fibulator was starting up. Yeah. And that's when I started to hang around down there. Oh, and there was also, God, I mean, Jesus Christ, I can't believe I forgot this. There was also a movie theater there that was private. There was a warehouse space. Do you know about the No Theater?
No.
Wow. See, this is more like lost Oakland history. Just Hecko's, if you went down to street level and you walked down 7th Street, 3 doors, I think, there was a movie theater that was built in the teens or 20s called the Lincoln Theater. And it had been closed for, at that point, it had been closed for like 30 years. And at some point, this guy called Peter Frog, that was not his real last name, but Peter Frog and some friends lived in there. They converted it into a living space. But the theater, the movie theater was intact. The seats were out, but it had the stage, the proscenium, the curtains, and a big sloping floor. And then I guess they set up bedrooms like up in the balcony area or whatever. And that was like the center of the universe for a couple of years. Again, like 90, 91. Thinking Fellers may have played there. Fibrillator for sure. Monopause hadn't started yet. Lots of just like weird jazz jams and shit. I had a film series in there too. I had a film series in the No Theater around 1991. That was an unbelievably great space because it was like an actual theater, an actual venue, completely underground, as opposed to a warehouse adapted space. It was a repurposed movie theater. I mean, what more could you ask for? And it fell down. It fell down on its own. Like after people moved out, they got evicted, I think, or left, and the building started to decay. And one night, it literally collapsed on itself. Mark called me, and like I heard this huge bang and this cloud of dust, and the No Theater is a pile of rubble. So that's how fucking unsafe that was, you know?
I have to thank you for Eyes, Ears, and Throat. Those were amazing, Def Punk, and then I also want to ask about In the Red. But
Yeah.
how did you come to be involved in those, and what was the status of the film for say Def Punk? Because it's there was only like 8 to 10 minutes, but I don't know if there was
Yeah.
other footage or.
That probably there might have been some, but yeah, that's a mysterious situation because the filmmaker Richard Gaikowski is dead. The negative is gone. The only copies of the film that exist are a handful of prints in one in private hands, which I couldn't get access to, and one that Gaikowski's like estate, as it were, had donated to the PFA, and that's the one I used for the restoration. The understanding I have of that film is that Gaikowski didn't film that material. It was filmed by another filmmaker who either couldn't come up with anything or just didn't know what to do with it and handed it off to Richard, and Richard edited that incredible collage that we see now. And I am not clear whether like the slow motion, which is like so fantastic, if you remember when the offs are playing and people are like dancing up and down, it's like a crazy ballet. I don't know if that was done by the filmmaker in the camera or if that was done by Gaikowski in the lab. I would like to believe that it was done by Gaikowski in the lab as like a aesthetic choice because it's so beautiful. But the only other film I've seen of his is the one that is in that compilation, which is Moody Teenager, and that's pretty different. So yeah, he's an enigma. He was an enigma. He had he distributed films. He distributed like other people's films too for a short time. He was just sort of like another Bay Area underground filmmaker, but he cranked out a couple of these things. And yeah, and I saw it at the PFA in its original sort of preservation print version that they had done, and I was so blown away. Like I became obsessed with the film, even though it's only like 7 minutes, like you say. Just I really wanted to restore it again and do it a little bit better. And it was a years long odyssey to be able to do that. The whole Ears, Eyes, Throats comp was my curating because I basically, at the time, I still am, but at the time, Refn and I were doing this this website of a new restored film every month. So I was basically cranking out a feature film restoration every fucking month for a year and a half. It was completely insane. Nobody should ever do that. And I pitched the idea of a punk rock series to him. And I was like, I know where some of this material is. I think this would make a good chapter in our online magazine. And so that's why it happened. Also, I had been horrified. I hope this isn't too much of a digression, but I've been horrified by what I saw in the Residents documentary, The Eyes Scream. Was that what it was called? It's pretty good.
That sounds right. Okay.
But anyway, what I was horrified by the quality of the clips from their films that were so awful. And I thought, like, wait a minute, I know these could look better because I know where the negatives are. They're Hardy gave them to the PFA. Why isn't this done? So I just reached out to Homer and I said, man, this is a disaster. Somebody's got to do something. He's like, well, sure, if you want to, go right ahead. So he basically gave me free reign and free access. And I borrowed the negatives and I created those new versions. So yeah, that was all just because I couldn't stand having them in the public consciousness looking that way. Like, they just needed to look better. Like, I had seen them look better, in past decades, and thought, like, this is not the way the public needs to know these movies. So yeah, that's kind of how that whole thing came together. And I became Devo's sort of I don't know, side hustle archivist. So I made friends with them years ago, and then because they came to me for something, and then I just started plundering their vaults and doing all this work. And I did the same thing. I was like, why are these versions of your seminal films so awful? Let's do something about it. And so I raised a little money and I did those 2 Devo films, and I've got more in the can now too that I'm not sure what we're going to do with. And so with all those things and In the Red was an obsession for 20 years. Had to have been for 20 years.
Was that so In the Red was filmed in 1978, and I quoted
Correct.
a couple of bits from that because it's the only, say, the only footage of I quoted from Will Shatter, not the only footage of him, but Detroit, talking about Michael Kowalski. There are these, and she's alive but not really reachable, and so
no, she does not want to.
yeah,
She does not want
right,
that involvement. No.
right, and so that was gold, because I was already, let's say it was 2018, 2019 when I came across that. I was already well into this, but it connected so many dots, or it was the first.
Oh, great.
That era in particular, though, I mean, the footage that exists is so rare. Even the audio recordings are rare, but the video recordings are just like, you just get these very little glimpses. And so 'cause I wasn't there, and so I have this, mental picture, but then it gets filtered through these short films of, the Deaf. That's my only video footage I've seen of the inside of the Deaf Club.
It's the only footage that exists, as far as I know. There isn't. There was never any video shot there, just that film and still pictures.
Right. So was In the Red, was that finished, and
No.
was that ever screened at the time that was left
I
unfinished?
can't say that it wasn't screened, but it couldn't have been shown much. And I mean, I only know it because I used to work with Liz at the Exploratorium in the mid 1990s, Liz Keim, who co-directed it.
Okay.
And she just mentioned it to me one day, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And she gives me a shitty video transfer of it. It blew my head off. And from that point forward, like, I want to say 95, 6, I was like, Liz, we have to do something. And then I wasn't restoring film then, so I didn't have the mechanism. But back then I was like, something's got to happen with this movie. And then I was digging around in the Exploratorium storage, and I found her original negatives and all her tapes, like in a moldy canvas bag. Like, I'm like, Liz, and it took years and years. But I was the person that basically rediscovered and championed that film without tooting my own horn. It's just the truth. I turned Craig onto it, and he had Liz Baldwin, and she showed it at Other Cinema, again, pre-restoration. So it had been shown then. It had been shown at the Roxy in a like a punk collection, but again, pre-restoration, just from a really bad videotape, terrible color, terrible sound. That was it, I think. I mean, because they never finished it, and I don't think it was because they didn't want to. I think they just ran out of steam. I that's the impression that Liz gives me. It's like they never quite got it in the state they wanted, and then they went on with their lives. They were young and they were students, and then they wound up getting into jobs, and Liz threw herself into the Exploratorium, and she's been there for like 40 years. And so it just never happened. So the reason why it just kind of ends is because it just kind of ends. There isn't really an ending. I don't think that was their ending. But the edit you see is the way they edited it.
I was wondering if if you could verify this story, because I swear I read this, but then I could not remember where I read it and therefore couldn't cite it. But the Mutant 7-inch on
Mhm.
415 is three
Mhm.
songs, and I think it's 33 RPM on one side and 45 RPM on the other. Maybe
I have it.
two
I have to
songs.
check.
Yeah, and but I read, I think this was from Fritz saying that he hit a plosive at one point on one of the songs, and that was causing problems with the mastering, so they had to lower the volume so that it wouldn't cause the record to skip. Does that sound familiar at all? It
Yeah,
was probably a new.
that's basically right. I mean, it was not a great master. I'm sure somebody could have done a little bit more surgical job if they'd have had the money or the time even then to probably duck that plosive. But yeah, that's right. The whole thing was pretty quiet. Lacked a certain amount of balls. It wasn't awful, but yes, that's right. That's right. And that tape was missing forever, and then suddenly, right, not long before he tragically died, Paul, the bass player of the Mutants, who wasn't even on that session, um, but he's the guy I replaced. He found that tape in his storage space, the multi-track, and so that's I went back to it and made a new mix, and that's what's on Curse of the Easily Amused, or the two songs from
Okay,
it. Are there two? I can't remember,
just
but
one.
just one.
It's
Oh,
just
I've done it
Insect
all.
Lounge. Yeah, I was wondering why the other the two new songs, New Drug and New Dark Ages, didn't make it on there.
It's because we were trying to go for unreleased material primarily, and also we want to
Okay.
save stuff for the next release.
Oh,
We
there's
have
more. Okay.
we have plans. We have plans. Yes, yes.
Before this CD came out, my perspective was that was the best record of the Mutants, and then the live tracks on the Def Club compilation were good, but I
Well,
think the
I love the album.
you did okay. Yeah, I felt like, I mean, it's a different era, and I felt like the band. I talked to John Gullick and Sally,
Mhm.
and neither one of them seemed particularly thrilled, and they had some funny stories about the process of
Oh, it was
recording
a
it.
clusterfuck of epic.
Yeah.
Yeah, they told you.
And
Yeah.
it was much later. So anyway, my rambling thing here was that it felt like, wow, there must have been a lot more. They were playing out regularly for 5-6 years, and they would have had all these songs, and people loved the Mutants. But for a listener prior to this CD, if you wanted to hear them in that late '70s incarnation, you basically had the three songs on the 7-inch and the live tracks. And as far as I know, it's less when we're into bootleg, we're able to get bootleg. That was all there was.
Well, not
I don't
quite.
know if that's accurate. Okay.
It's not actually accurate, although
Okay.
but we would rather kind of forget this even happened. But the record, the Fun Terminal record, was re-released on the White Noise label on a CD.
Oh,
In
yeah, I have that. Yeah.
That's got a bunch of stuff that would not a bunch, but some stuff that would later wind up on Curse the Easily Amused. They did this amazing demo in Shangri-La Studios in Malibu, which is now owned by Rick Rubin, but of course wasn't back then. Think, Too Much Too Soon. Um, why am I blanking out? But anyway, all four of those are bonus. They're bonus tracks on that CD.
Okay.
But the thing about that fucking CD is that every single source was a horrible cassette. Like there was no attempt made to deal with the masters, and also the LP master was lost at that time. It was locked away in Fantasy because their criminal cocaine dealing label hadn't paid the bill. So they had to master the CD from a vinyl. They did a fair job, but all that extra stuff on there, including the songs from the 7-inch and everything, they're all from terrible sources. And that's why when I did Curse, I insisted that we go do this right and go back to the masters, which I have since relocated, right? So in a
Okay.
sense, those tracks were out there. I mean, there are unreleased songs too on Curse that definitely have never come out, but there's like six or
Okay.
seven that were on, yeah, that were on the reissue.
Okay. 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 So they were maybe par for the course, because certainly the more headline type bands from that era, Mutant Sleepers, Negative Trend, Avengers, they weren't really making albums in the late '70s. Nobody was making
No,
albums, and it took until later bands that survived long enough, or whether the Nuns reformed to record an album. So it got that era in San Francisco um, didn't. I don't know. It is kind of this lost thing where there's documentation and there was a lot of great stuff happening, but it's bits and pieces, and
I
it's
think that's
always
fair.
something that
Yeah,
yeah
it's
takes some digging, and there's a lot of what if, what might have been.
mhm.
But a lot of growing up on the East Coast, this was stuff that didn't get reviewed in the record guides because those would be primarily focusing on LPs. The stuff was not even close to being in print, with very few exceptions when I was buying records in the early 90s, mid 90s. So, um, but it doesn't seem to have lost any luster, 40 years on. I don't
Well,
know that.
if it's good, it's going to hold up. I mean, it's just if it's good music, it's going to hold up. So, but I mean, to that point, there's at least one band that I could think of that was from the original Mab era, which has no documentation whatsoever. I mean, maybe not even photographs. And it's this band called Magister Ludi, which both Penelope and somebody else have talked about as being this like totally like they were nothing like anybody else, fucked up psych band, really weird, really great. And in the outtakes for Louder, Faster, Shorter, there's a brief silent shot of them playing, like the camera's on for a second, no sound. That's all you get,
Okay.
you know.
Okay.
So I mean, there are a couple of those people. And then who was the guy? He did one single that was so great. The Mutants backed him. He was
Oh,
black.
yep.
Snooky
Snooky
Tape.
Tape. Yep.
There's an example. Like, where's that master? Who knows? Yeah, I mean, it's just yeah. Like when we did the No Mercy record, they had a album or EP, I mean, a long EP recorded by Tom Tadlock, and they had the master tape, and it just got put in the wrong place and got demagnetized. It was wiped, So all that was left was cassette copies, I believe, and that's what we made the record from. I mean, there's all kinds of shit like that. The Mutants, the Mutants 7-inch should have come out in 78, but it took till 1980, so they completely blew the momentum on that.
Right. That's okay. That's interesting because I didn't know, exactly the recording date. There was a review by Chris Desjardins,
Mhm.
in Slash that I quoted from. That it was a really positive review, but right at the point, but things were moving so fast, moving so
Yep.
quickly, that the difference between 1980 and 1978 was huge.
Oh,
Whereas,
huge.
I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know that time just doesn't pass the same way that it used to in music. But 2 years now versus 2 years then, I don't know.
There's,
There's something
yeah.
metaphysical about that.
Well,
But that
there's
particular
way more
era, yeah,
bands and there's way more media, between those two
right, yeah.
things. I mean, everything. My opinion of this is that everything changed in 1993 or whatever when Nirvana hit big. I mean, it's just like everything changed. There was no longer a kind of like a defined pool of a handful of interesting independent artists or whatever. Like suddenly, CMJ was just could have been a phone book. Like it was so much noise, so much shit, and then the internet kicks in a couple years later, and that just makes it even crazier. And so, yeah, the time is completely that kind of evolution of music, completely radically different now. Like it has been for a long time. It's a gone concept that stuff can organically move along with a smaller group of people. I don't mean from an elitist standpoint. I mean like literally from a just the way the world works. Everything is just out and there's tons of it and it's constantly coming and it's a very different, landscape.
Yeah, and then also the role of actual physical space, where I think it's just hard to imagine the physical space having the same, playing the same role now because
Yeah.
everything is kind of virtual first and
Yes.
foremost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's very different. And then and so I mean, it's a cliche, but it's so true. Is like the sense of community and whatnot is so important when you're especially when you're like a naive musician, quote unquote artist, whatever, and you get buttressed by the people around you. I mean, the Mutants grew out of CCA, which was CCAC, and SFAI, and Monopause grew up out of the Heinz scene and our friends on 7th Street, and that's all physical proximity and kind of, as you say, sort of like um, centering around one or two spots, where people physically go. I mean, starting with Spockmorg and all the way through, it's like, the digital meeting rooms serve the same purpose, I think, on a certain level, but it is a little different when it's like the bands are swapping members and stuff, because you're physically in the same place and you are truly influencing each other, as opposed to with the digital remove influencing each other. So yeah, it's very different.
And then for San Francisco, that has two different impacts. I mean, there's one impact on just the way the music is made and distributed, but there's also the fact that that became the capital of Silicon Valley, or at least the
Yeah. I mean, what was Greg Freeman's Lowdown Studios in Dogpatch, where so many great records were made, is now like it's the ballpark and condos.
Okay, yeah.
And I mean, yeah, of course. It's like it's a total fucking miracle that Artist Television Access, ATA, is still open and it's still there. It's incredible. It's fantastic. But they're a nonprofit and they can pull it off. Same as the Roxy is also a nonprofit. But otherwise, everything's gone. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's all fucking gone. This is a little digression, but my friend Dale in MX80 has spent most of his adult life until he retired working in movie theaters. And we realized that as of, probably a month or so, there's not going to be a single movie theater left in the city of Berkeley. Zero. Because the UA is closing and the Elmwood's going to close. And those are the two last ones. And people just don't, I think that people are going to forget the level of community and togetherness that even just comes from a movie theater, let alone a performance space, and the idea of seeing a movie communally, it's not like it's going to die. There's always going to be some, places for movies. But yeah, this was a shocking and depressing piece of reality that, the city where I grew up is going to have 0 movie theaters after having 22. It's like, whoa.
You mentioned in the email that the Mutants, it was kind of a teenage dream. How old were you when you first saw them or were aware of their music?
Oh, well, they didn't play for 18 years. So I just missed them. I mean, I could have seen them at the on Broadway, but I didn't. I don't think I found their record for another year or two. So mid to late 80s, I found the Fun Terminal record in the store and got into them. And yeah, I was obsessed with them for 15 whatever years. They did one reunion in 89 at the DNA Lounge, which for some dumb reason I didn't go to. I remember when it happened and I just didn't go, like a dumb shit. Digression. I also remember when Snakefinger played at the Berkeley Square in 1987 with his band, with the Vestal Virgins. I was a huge Snakefinger Residence fan, and I thought, nah, I think I'm going to go just get stoned and eat pizza up on, on Grizzly Peak, which I did, and then he died. Anyway, sorry, what was the original reason why?
Yeah, the Mutants. So you
Right.
you actually came
Right.
in through the Fun Terminal. Okay, interesting.
Absolutely. And then and Louder, Faster, Shorter, the movie it followed not long after that. So we're talking mid 80s. So they were done, and then in 89 they did one show, then they didn't play for 16 years, I think. So I saw them for the first time in 05 or 06 when they had just started doing shows again at the Denord. And
okay.
around that time, and I already knew Jim from MX80, O-Type, Grifters, bunch of bands. He was in the latter version of the Mutants. He was in the when the Mutants splintered in 84, 3, and John, Brendan, Dave left, and the singers stayed in, there. They got a whole new instrument lineup, and Jim was in that band. The only person who stayed constant was Paul on bass. So I already knew Jim, knew that he was in the Mutants. He was in the reunion version of the Mutants in 06. And I was starting to play music with Jim as I think in 97 or something. So there were already these weird interlocking things. Jim introduced me to Dave, the drummer of the Mutants, and we started a band together, which only ever played out once. It was basically just a recording project and a jamming part called the Bisonics. And that was me, Jim, and Dave. And somewhere in there, Paul announced he was leaving the Mutants. So this is about 10 years ago. And Dave's like, I think you should join the Mutants. And I'm like, oh, come on, give me a break. I could never do that. And I did. So and then Paul died a couple years after that. He left before he died. So yeah, I mean, I was totally into them, totally thrilled. And sometimes I don't know if Mia told you this, but sometimes when Mia and I are rehearsing with the Mutants, we just like look across the room and we just smile at each other, like, can you fucking believe this is happening? We still have the same, even though I've been friends with them forever, since long before I was in the band. There's something about playing that in that band that is just like a dream come true. It's fucking great.
Yeah, I think the new CD, just as a listening experience, I think it's really well sequenced,
Good.
and then, but as
Thank
far as
you.
their songwriting goes, they would have been the most kind of traditional of those Mabuhay era bands, as far as maybe traditional isn't the right word. I
Well, I know
definitely
where
want
you're
to say
going with this.
conventional.
There's rock and
Yeah,
roll. There's rock and roll roots in their music.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
Brendan, some of the songs we do are just straight up Rolling Stones cops. There's one, it's not on the record, I don't think, Twit, that is just straight up Stonesy vibe, just with the tempo a little bit up. Absolutely. But you could say the same
yeah.
for Crime to a certain extent. You could say the same for, a couple of other bands that sort of had a rock and roll kind of like, you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah, yeah. Although with Crime, you would have this sort of, you know, no pun intended, but repulsive kind of tones and off-putting, like scraping guitar tones that would,
Right, right, right,
or the
right.
drums going all over the place that would keep it from kind of sounding like that. But it's kind of that's kind of what Chris D said in his review. It's like you might. I guess he's talking to a more of an LA audience. You might think that it was that it was more along the lines of a novelty based on what you might know about seeing a photo of the band or something. But when you get right down to it, it's just really good songs, and it does have more of
Yeah.
a timeless quality. Whereas if it came out in 1980, it could have been looked at as, we're onto hardcore or something,
Yeah.
or we're onto something. So it hasn't really dated the way that certain things might have,
No, I
from
think the
those
stuff
days.
is very, very fresh. I mean, I was super confident when the label approached us about doing something. They were originally talking about doing Fun Terminal, and I'm like, you know what? There's already been a reissue of Fun Terminal. I am sitting on all these tapes, and they wrote so many songs that weren't even recorded. Let's start from scratch and make a new record. And I'm so glad we did, because the response seems to be pretty universal, that it was kind of like the missing link of Mutants recordings. I mean, it is, and there's more. There's still quite a bit more. It couldn't do quite a whole nother volume, but we come pretty close,
Okay.
because they
Yeah.
wrote a lot of songs. They wrote a lot of songs. I think there's like 50 songs in the canon or something. I think that's the number. It's a 50-ish, in 5 years.
Okay. I would hear similar things from the Sleepers, and there was a quote from Jello Biafra in the reissue that came out in the 90s, or compilation, that said like he saw entire sets come and go, like of
Hmm.
songs, and they, for their own reasons, didn't get them all recorded. And really, I've talked to certainly Michael and then Paul Draper, and there just isn't much left.
Hmm.
There isn't really anything left, and so it's kind of, what you get is what you get. Are you, I don't know if you would be able to talk about this, but do you have any other projects that are involving that particular era, that late 70s, early 80s
Oh,
era
I've
within
signed an
the band?
NDA, Will, and I'm afraid I can't. No. Um,
Teasers.
well, I will tell you this. I don't think this is not a secret. Is that I have transferred every single note that was ever recorded, and that's almost all of their shows of uh, oh my God, the Screamers, and
Oh,
and all that's ever come out it really is the 4-song EP, the demo, on Superior Viaduct. I mean, there's been compilations and things, but I mean, there's a chance for like a whole nother incredible Screamers release if they wanted to do it, if everybody agreed. And I just, all those tapes are just sitting on my computer. I transferred
okay.
every note, stuff that they didn't even know they still had. The KK kept a pretty good collection of tape, um, and Devo too. I mean, I can tell you this is no, we can put this on the record, is that there is a archival release of Devo material coming out, which the world has never heard. It hasn't been announced yet, though, so I can't get into too much specifics. But it's enormous. It's gonna be like a 3 record set of mostly unreleased Devo songs that I've found and transferred. So, but from San Francisco, I mean, yeah, as I said, there's a handful of Mutants things, but I don't have any other projects in the pipeline with the other bands. I wanted to do more with the rest, but there's just, it's like there's nothing. There's nothing in terms of film. A lot is missing. A couple negatives are missing. I tried to do Man. I still have the copy of it, but Man in the Dark Sedan, the Residents Snakefinger video. It's basically Snakefinger. That film negative is missing. I only have a dupe. But like shit just goes missing. I mean, Whip It, one of the most famous videos of all time. The negative is lost. I searched everywhere in their archive and it's lost. It's like Warner Brothers probably had access to it and they just never returned it or something. Like I have a photochemical copy that's pretty good, but so but nothing else. Unless I'm forgetting something.
Yeah, no, I remember the In Eyes, Ears, and Throats. I think Def Punk and In the Red were at the beginning, and then it segues into these color videos. And as someone who first experienced, music videos, let's say, oh, I remember we had HBO and had a 1982 video jukebox, so like Total Eclipse of the Heart, and then we got MTV. And I think a lot of us, in let's say my age group who were coming along then, didn't realize that, first of all, bands had been making videos, but they were something that was more, you had Bruce Conner working with Devo, and
Yeah.
then I don't know much about him, but Graham Whiffler, is that?
Yeah. He did all those Residence films. Yeah, and he sat with me and color corrected all of the new restorations, so they are very much the way he wanted them.
Okay, and I can't remember if the Tuxedo Moon Jinx video is on that
Yep.
compilation. I don't think, but he did that video as well, right?
Yes, it's great. I actually have the negative of that, the original negative, sitting in my back room right now, just waiting to be restored. It's on loan from the PFA, and I just haven't raised the money to do it. But yeah, he really wants that done too. He's like, that's to him, that's like the missing one, and it's great. But yeah,
Yeah, that's a great video, and that was another dimension. I mean, certainly not every band was doing videos like that, but on the other hand, you realize it's almost like another one of these alternate pathways that things could have gone. It's like you have this medium, music video,
yeah.
and with a band like Devo, they're doing things with it that just go over and above the music. I mean, it really changes the way, for me, like you would perceive the music. You see this
Oh,
concept.
completely. But they always imagined themselves as a multimedia group. They didn't just imagine themselves as a band. They're on record saying, we want to be filmmakers, we want to be on TV, we want to do everything. Yeah.
Right, right. And so that would be true of the Residents as well,
Totally.
whether or not they proclaimed it. And then um, that is another tradition that is not neither one of. I mean, Devo is not San Francisco, but that tradition is not exclusive to San Francisco. But that's another thread that winds its way through with say Carolina,
Oh God, yeah.
the visual aspect, and then
I hope history doesn't forget them. I hope.
they definitely feature heavily in this book. There's several chapters.
I mean, you were here, so you remember. I mean, they're sort of like, they were sort of like the superstars in a way. I mean, they were sort of like, to me anyway, to a lot of, they were just held up in another place, just because of what they accomplished.
I didn't see them in the prime era. I mean, in the era
Oh, okay.
of the late 80s, early 90s. So I was, and people would always tell me, you didn't see them back when. And
Oh, bullshit. They were the same. I mean, they got a little bit more tight as a band, because Grux would get people in who would play a little better, but nah, fuck. I mean, I saw them at Gilman in '87 and it was incredible. And that's like, I've never seen anything like this. And I felt the same way when I saw them whenever the last time was, so yeah. Yeah. I saw the Thinking Fellers open for Negativland in '87 at Gilman, one of their first shows.
Right. That's how the Thinking Fellers enter the narrative with the Gilman Street, and
Mhm.
because I had no clue about that
We used to
until
rehearse there. Yeah.
right, exactly. And so that it was what's his name, Seymour Glass,
Yep.
however one knows him, who told me some of that, and that's another part of East Bay stuff that kind of works its way into this. But you definitely, let's say, if you my age, I would hear about Gilman Street, and in the context of this kind of mall punk. Didn't realize, and again, I'll call him Seymour because I don't know him personally. He was telling me about how there was Friday night experimental, more the
Mhm.
experimental night, and Saturday night. So Friday night you would have at Gilman Street the likes of Negativland, Thinking Fellers. Who else might have been? I'm not
Oh,
sure if
the Japanese bands played there, Ruins and
okay.
Fushitsucha, and yeah, his show was 2 minutes long. That was just unbelievable. He screamed into this weird ball-like microphone for 2 minutes, then he threw it down, and that was it. It was so
That
awesome.
was that Masana?
I
Masana?
was Masana. It was Masana. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Okay. Because I've heard about that a show from
yeah,
other people, and
yeah, yeah. You know about the Feeders show with the dead dog? Do you know about this?
I've heard about that. I think.
Yeah, I was at that
Uh,
show. Those
okay.
there are certain things that just I will never unsee. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm not sure if this is accurate or not because this is just my own perspective. Getting out there, I didn't have the. I came out there with this idea of things like Amarillo Records and stuff like that, as like what I thought was going to be like
It
happening.
just cracks me up. Like the idea
Yeah.
that anybody would have that label in their head and be like, that's where I'm going.
Exactly, exactly. That's kind of where the whole thing started for me. And
Awesome. Fantastic.
that was defunct in the sense, I mean, the label was defunct, and that orbit of bands didn't really exist. And it took me a while through just meeting people because I didn't know anybody to start seeing finding places to go. And that I think the very first place I saw kind of an underground show was the Clit Stop. Would have been
Oh, fuck. I
2000.
love that place. Yeah. Another fire trap. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then I think that from the most interesting era in term for me in terms of when I was physically out there was when it was really undefined, like 2000, 2001, 2002. I didn't know how other people knew each other, and it seemed like a lot of people were meeting each other.
Mhm.
But I've for the first time, and but it seemed to me to have almost no continuity with what I had been interested in before.
Hmm.
And then later I came across, when the Sun City Girls came, and I would learn about you all, or started, there was a Poorest album in
Mhm.
2002. And I thought, this relates more to the stuff that I was interested in before. And
Mhm.
um, in terms of, I don't know, these words are tricky, but concept, multimedia ideas that you're not going
Mhm.
to necessarily see it.
Theatrical.
Yeah, theatrical, and there was one of the Monopause articles that the word performance came up, and that's certainly a thread in the early punk era. It's bands like Tuxedo Moon, or
The
Neung
Mutants.
Phak had Mutants. Okay, that's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah,
The Mutants were very
and
theatrical.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. How would you since you were actually there the whole time? Did the early 2000s, say after the .com bust, kind of did things seem revitalized to you,
Yeah.
or
Oh, for sure. Oh, absolutely. I mean, that was, yeah. I mean, Crack, We Are Rock. They were just total fucking stars. Pink and Brown before, what's his name hit so big. You know what I'm
Mhm.
talking about. The OCs.
Yes,
Why am I? He's
yeah,
a nice guy. Why am I spacing
John
on
Dwyer.
John Dwyer? Thank you. But I mean, all leading up to that and into that, I think that was a really super fertile period. Absolutely. And there were a lot of terrific incestuous shit with everybody in other bands. And oh yeah, I think that was great. And also because suddenly the rents were affordable again, for a short time. And I mean, Crack lived in a not the whole band, but lived in a storefront next to this, like it was behind a bike repair shop on Valencia or Mission.
Okay, okay, right, right. Yeah, okay, I remember that. And they also had a storefront space near 16th and Mission, or Eric Bauer maybe.
No, that's what I'm talking about. It's
Um,
Eric Bauer space.
oh,
Yeah.
that's right. Okay,
And
okay,
that place, the reason why they got that space was, and it was a huge, fantastic space, and it was completely outfitted with Ethernet everywhere, so they could like because it was one of these ridiculous .com bad idea businesses. It was online dry cleaning, which at the time was like the biggest laugh of all time, and it failed, and they got that space for nothing for a couple of years. Yeah, so that was, I mean, there were a lot of terrific results of the .com bust, no question. It made some of
right.
Monopause's comedy immediately dated, but because we were making jokes about cell phones as the status symbol and shit, and that disappeared. I mean, the White Ring, which was our fundamentalist
Mhm.
Christian Gulf War veteran band, our big show was on the first anniversary of September 11th. So it was September 11th, 2002. And the .com bust had happened, but there were still these like crazy money trickles. And so we were this very clever poet who somehow managed to connive this gallery into letting him book shows there, put us in there. It was called the Blue Room Gallery on Mission. And I mean, there were these ghastly sculptures, horses made of brass or something, and they were like $25,000. I mean, it was like the worst
Wow.
fucking art for crazy rich people. And the White Ring show was in there, surrounded by this horrific art that's like a leftover from the crazy.com, nuttiness. So it did make for some good creative fodder to have that giant sucking sound, as Ross Perot would say, the money all going away.
Okay, and I'll admit that I didn't quite always. I would hear things about like the show that you all did. I might be mixing two of them together because I wasn't there at this one, but the one with the dialogue, the stage banter that was pre-recorded.
Pre-recorded. That might have been with the Sun City Girls, or I can't remember, or Avico. I don't know. We did so many shows at the bottom of the hill. It was the bottom of the hill. Yeah,
Oh, okay, okay, yeah, and it was
that was fun.
that was something that came through again. I don't mean to say that this was invented in San Francisco, but that idea of every show is we're going to do this time, and this
It's
next time
it's
you
an
might see
event.
something completely different. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's an
it's an
event.
event.
Yeah,
It's a performance. We tried not to repeat ourselves if possible, even though we had songs that we would repeat. Yeah, we just pushed ourselves to come up with some new prank shtick, thing. I mean, I think of us as sort of like situationist rock. I mean, it was definitely, that's why we were such a good simpatico with the Sun City Girls on a certain level, because they had a much darker, I think, way of going about it. But it was the same idea. It's like you're going to do a 3-night stand of shows, and you're going to basically give people 3 different bands is what they would do. And
right.
I mean, yeah, it's very inspiring. And we all definitely swim in that same ocean. I remember being really disappointed by the Residents at some point, when I felt like suddenly what they were doing felt like shtick instead of like a really creative performance. It was like Homer broke the fourth wall and started addressing the audience, and I just thought, like, no, wait a minute, that's not, that's not the Residents. I had a kind of like a hardcore feeling about it. I never quite got over that, and that was a long time ago. That was like, I don't know, early 2000s, I think, or even before. I don't
Yeah, it's a high standard. I mean, as a well, a fan or observer or a listener, um, I try to keep that in mind that, any band that's going to hold themselves to that standard. I mean, for one thing, there's a lot that has to go into it to it's not like you learn a set and then you just roll out that
Right.
set every time. And then the other thing is it makes it from a success perspective, it's going to make things harder because anybody who just started to catch up with what you were doing before is now
Yeah.
going to be but then that ideal of doing that is sort of kind of what I was chasing after and sort of would always find so interesting, and how the people themselves would um, manage to navigate real life while doing that, it takes a toll, and it always requires. Uh, for me, it's not. I feel like it's not fair to just say, why did they start doing this? They started. It turned into shtick at this point, or they sold out, and it's like, well, you just realize how much of a struggle, maybe, or
Absolutely.
it's an uphill climb to do those kinds of things.
And sometimes you should just stop. I mean, sometimes you should stop, back off, I mean, yeah, that's just
That's another valid. Yeah, a lot of people
that
have
has to
died.
I think that has to
So
happen
yeah.
sometimes. I mean, I'm not saying that I've ever done that, but I wish I had a couple times. I mean, I certainly felt that way with Negativland, and but with Monopause, we morphed into Neung Phak and then sort of stayed that way. There wasn't a lot of Monopause after that, and so that gave us. But we pushed really hard on that too. We were constantly trying to come up with new tunes. We had our own theatrical fucked up shit at each one of those shows too. So it was the same, just trying not to be too repetitive. But that band allowed us to kind of like play the hits. Like we knew the songs were actually remembered, as opposed to with Monopause where nobody remembers the songs. It gave us a different platform.
Yeah, I saw quite a few of those shows, and really, I remember I didn't ever make this proclamation, but there was a brief period where I was thinking best band in San Francisco, and I like the idea of somebody said, "Wait a second, you're going to say that a band that's doing covers of Southeast Asian pop songs from cassettes is the best band?" I don't exactly know what my even argument would have been, but I like the idea that yeah, it's this really specific thing,
Yeah.
and that you would I talk way more than some people would probably think I should about the Popo Pies, but here's this thing that sounds like this absurd gimmick that okay, 30 seconds is enough, but then you do more with it, and then it brings out more depth. And so a lot of these, so much of what's in the book, not the whole thing, because you do have bands that play songs and have regular sets, but a lot of it is this stuff that is playing around with the very idea of what it is to be in a band or to have an
Absolutely.
audience, and that
That's the most important thing for me, is to constantly be questioning that, even with the Mutants. I mean, I'm trying to subvert it somehow and just give myself some kicks I mean, the last couple shows I've performed with uh, uh, a mosquito net over my head, like, and it's just the most bizarre, I'd rather do that than just stand there, you know, uh, yeah, it's just it's part of the that's where I'm gonna want to be pushing it. The only time I get to not do that and just basically play in a band is with Malcolm Mooney, and we rarely ever play, unfortunately. But that's the closest I get to that sort of thing, where it's straight, where it's basically straight. you know
I feel like something that would have been challenging for, say, Negativland would be that a lot of the voice of that kind of the satirical elements that would go along with it almost
Mhm.
became like there will be satire and that is um, effective, and then it gets co-opted.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think to me, I lost a lot of interest in doing Negative Land because I felt like, I mean, this is just me speaking, but I felt like it's just every it cutting up shit and recontextualizing, and also archly parodying something or ironically parodying something is the mode of communication in so much, like, social media, pop culture, whatever. I mean, everybody is doing it, and I didn't feel like Negative Land had very much to say anymore. Like, we were just swimming along in a sort of sea of so much else, that what Don called culture jamming. Sure, we were pretty early on in making it. I mean, I would say we loosely because I wasn't in the band then, but I mean, the band was very, I think, instrumental in, dare I say, popularizing a certain kind of cut up satire, a certain kind of pop culture blenderizing, culture jamming, whatever you want to call it, because of how much college airplay the band got, and just how there weren't a lot of fish in the sea. Again, back to our discussion about how everything, the landscape has changed. And so I felt like up to about 2000, when we did the True False tour, I felt like we were still participating in that and really contributing something to that. But I don't know. It started to feel like that's not true. I'm really proud of what followed too. I'm really proud of It's All in Your Head, the last big record that we did, which is all about God. And we toured and made people wear blindfolds in the audience. We handed out blindfolds so that they couldn't see, because the idea was it was a radio show. So you're actually going to sit in an audience with a fucking blindfold on. And a lot of people did it. I was very proud of that whole business. But everyone that is the mode of communication now. I mean, it's the billboards you see for products there. It's all the same sort of ironic satire aesthetic. And I just lost interest. I lost interest. I'd rather try to be subverting the concepts in some other way. It's too much noise. It's everywhere,
Yeah, that gets back to what I was groping at earlier, as far as the different challenges. You can be successful even if it's not big time commercial success, but artistically successful, and then the platform underneath you moves, or the things that were. Yeah, I think Negativland is one good example. I also think, Amarillo Records. I mean, that was huge for when I came across that, and Breakfast Without Meat, and some of these other things. It was like, wow, you have because that was my first exposure to something that felt like it really resonated with something that I had never seen expressed that
Yeah,
way
sure.
before. And then, I mean, it pains me to say this, but there are whole spaces, like I'm not really part of them, but I look at them and it's like, wow, this has really become absorbed into. It's not exactly the same aesthetic as the Negativland, but kind of meta, blurring the lines between.
Right.
I don't know. It would be tough in any case, because these are very, like, all these people who are challenging the way of, like, how music or a band or an artist is perceived, subverting these things. Those types of subversion become the norm, and then what do you do?
Yeah. But that's also, we have to give a lot of leeway to culture, and that sort of culture having it become the norm means that, like, well, we won. I mean, like, okay, so we won. This has meaning for a greater number of people doing this. This is like the way culture communicates with each other now. And so I guess that's great, actually. That's just great. It pushes you harder to do something more off the wall. It pushes you harder to do something that, I mean, like, I don't, like, Monopause was already struggling with those sorts of things when we were doing the work we were doing. I mean, when we came up with the lip sync show idea, I feel pretty confident nobody else had done quite that. I feel pretty confident that was something that we pulled off that felt really original. Like, to pretend we were talking on stage, but we actually weren't. It was all pre-recorded, and then to trip the audience up at some point on purpose by screwing it up, so that the wall is broken and that you see that it's not actually happening. I mean, that was a big part of what we did, and I think there will always be room for somebody to do that, even when this kind of conceptual thinking and art is so mainstream. I still love it when seeing things that are done well. I mean, the Yes Men, when they pull off another incredible prank, it's like, wow, that's genius what you just convinced people to. Or I mean, just stupid fucking Elon fucking fascist Musk buying Twitter and then changing the authenticating process so that somebody could come up with a fake account and say, hi, we're Eli Lilly and insulin is free. I mean, great. Even though that's not like a new idea to impersonate a company and do that, it still has the same power, it's like it's still going to be believed for a few minutes, and so I have no problem with that being mainstreamed in a sense if it works, yeah, I mean, Devo was preaching de-evolution, and most of what they have said has come true. It's just like de-evolution is clearly very real in all kinds of ways. I don't think we're necessarily gonna, we didn't come from a line of brain-eating apes necessarily, but I mean, there's a lot of truth there. So.
Okay, yeah, I was also thinking when you said we won, sometimes there could be a sense of, we won, now what? Or this is
Oh,
winning.
sure. I mean, I'm being a little facetious, Will. I mean, yes, what exactly, is behind door number 3, something you really want to take home, once you buy a prize, it's yours to keep, like, yeah.
Would a man living in Los Angeles understand what a seagull is? Do we know about the ants there in the grass? Would the ants in the grass understand what the man's Volvo is? Do they know you can buy Pepsi in aluminum or glass?
For this commercial, the look, the style, and the music is everything. Lighting should be dramatic, but not shadowy. Location should be beautiful, but not weird. Clothing should be contemporary, but not punk. Casting should be characterizations, but not to the point of poodles. In other words, we can go